Okay, we start our series, Think Outside the Tomb, today. And just like to begin with an opening thought for you. The Roman Empire, during the years that it was in existence as a political and military force, utilized the capital punishment of crucifixion for about 400 of its years. And historians estimate that there were anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000 people, all total, that ended up crucified by the Roman Empire. Out of that 100,000 or so people, history does not record one person as having lived through it. Not even one. The Romans were very good at what they did. They perfected the form of crucifixion to such an extent that it was a terror to people. It was supposed to be a statement, not just like today's lethal injection where you take somebody's life and under as peaceful circumstances as you can. It was supposed to be brutal. It was supposed to be horrible. It was supposed to strike fear in the hearts of anybody that would challenge the empire. They were good at it. Nobody survived it. As a matter of fact, it was so brutal, I believe there's a word, excruciate. You know, that comes from the Latin meaning out of the cross. Eventually, not one person survived through it, including Jesus. We believe that he was crucified and it killed him. However, we also believed that he resurrected from that death. We're happy about that this morning. There are reactions to this thought. I don't believe it, being one of them. This is very typical. I don't believe what the churches say, the preachers say, the Bible says. I don't think that Jesus resurrected. That is one reaction. Another reaction comes from Christians. And they say, well, John, okay, I believe it. I've heard it all my life. I don't not believe it. It's just not doing much for me these days. I don't feel it. I'm not experiencing the resurrection. And I would say, you know, when the Bible talks about resurrection, it begins from a far more fundamental proposition than faith or feeling. It begins with fact. The Bible talks about resurrection as a fact. So regardless of whether you feel it, and regardless of whether you even believe it, it doesn't affect the fact, not one bit. It's like today, suppose we say, well, I don't believe that there was such a thing, such a struggle as the American Revolution. I think that that was just a romanticized kind of conflict. Historians sort of made it up. And there really probably wasn't a George Washington. He's just the accumulation of some heroic figures. I don't believe any of that. Well, go ahead. I mean, you could say, I don't feel very revolutionary. I'm not conscious of being free from England right now. Therefore, it's not that big a deal to me. Well, you know what? You haven't altered a bit the fact. You hadn't changed it. See, this is the beauty of a fact. You can wake up in a terrible mood if you're a believer, and that doesn't affect the fact not a bit. You can sit here and say, it's all a bunch of hogwash. I don't believe any of it. All that singing, you're just singing to thin air. There's nothing out there. Again, you haven't done a thing to alter it. Amazing. When the Bible speaks of resurrection, it talks about it with such certainty that we attach it to our calendar. It's a calendar event. And with such specific attachment that we can say, approximately 5-6 hours ago, 7 hours ago, on this day, 2,000 years ago, a man named Jesus rose from the dead. Wow. We got a fact. At least this is what the Bible assures us of. Before and above faith and feeling, there's the fact. As a matter of fact, the Apostle Paul presented a hypothetical scenario in the Bible for us. If you check your verses, I've got some verses for you quoted in the bulletin. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14. If you have a Bible, you can go there. If you have a Bible and you don't know it, go to the table of contents. I'll tell you real quick. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14. And Paul presents a hypothetical scenario in order to underline the absolute necessity of the resurrection of Jesus being a fact. And he starts this way: if Christ is not risen. If Christ is not risen, let's just say, if the whole thing's a hoax, a big misunderstanding, the product of believers' sincere wish fulfillment, or hallucination, etc. If he's not risen, Paul says, then our preaching is empty. I'm just tracking through the verse here. Then our preaching is empty. That includes all the teaching, all the preaching of the apostles, especially as what has been captured and written down on paper in our New Testament. All of a sudden, that New Testament is empty. It's sort of like if we take away the resurrection of Jesus as a fact, that's like plucking the main fuse out of a house fuse box at your home. And then the house just goes cold and dark. And that is exactly what happens to New Testament teaching. The whole thing goes cold and dark without the resurrected Christ, and it just begins to look like any of the other religious books on the earth, influenced by men who have died and in fact are still dead. It has no more moral or spiritual authority than any other book. This is what Paul's saying. Our preaching is empty. And now look at this. Your faith is also empty. Your faith is a bunch of hot air. If this didn't happen, your faith is hot air. In fact, it tends to look more like a beautiful delusion to help you get through, to numb the pain of life. Tragedies and diseases and the fact you're going to die. We just believe in this fairy tale so that we can get through life. That's what your faith is without the fact. Verse 17, 1 Corinthians 15:17, the verse right below it. Paul continues, if Christ is not risen, your faith is futile. That means ineffective. You can believe all you want. Believe yourself into a lather. Believe yourself into a sweat. But it'll be kind of like believing in a pot plant.